I've made them a few times and they are just okay. I like how this whole video is like, I tried a recipe before and it didn't work. Hi everyone, I'm Saffitz. Welcome to my home kitchen. Today I am answering your questions. So the last time I did a Q&A, I asked at the end if you have any questions about a particular kitchen fail, a recipe that didn't turn out, and also anything that you would like to try but are maybe a little bit intimidated to tackle. So today I'm going to answer all of your questions related to trials and tribulations in the kitchen.
Just wanted you to know I'd like to ask a question. Something's bugging me, been on my mind. Sure be great if you clarify.
I'm a little intimidated by making meringue and would love some tips. For example, when I make your flourless chocolate amaretto cake from Dessert Person, I always end up overbeating the meringue. Even when I think I've totally nailed it with the whisk test, when I go to mix it into the batter, it's streaky / hard to mix in. Other times I have made meringues and I get them to stiff peaks, but once I mix in the cocoa or black sesame, they become little puddles again. Okay, there's a couple different things going on here. There's making meringue and then there's beating egg whites. When you beat egg whites without sugar, it is really easy to go right just beyond that point of stiff peaks to where it gets grainy and dry and hard to incorporate. The more sugar you add, the more kind of supple and stable the meringue is, and it's much harder to get to that like overbeaten clumpy part, that clumpy phase. So you could try diverting a little bit of sugar in the recipe and adding it to the meringue that you're making so that you're like increasing that proportion of sugar. You get a more sort of supple texture. I would say if you're using a stand mixer for that part, don't go on full blast high speed. It's actually better to whip meringue and the egg whites at a like more medium speed. The slower you incorporate the air, the more stable it becomes. So definitely decrease the speed a little bit. And then about sort of mixing in the cocoa or black sesame, you get puddles. That is very common. When you're adding black sesame paste, for example, you're introducing fat into, and even to some extent with cocoa powder, you're adding fat to this unstable egg white and sugar mixture, so it's deflating the bubbles. I would just say mix less. That's really the key. When you've made a nice stiff meringue and you're incorporating something else into it, the less mixing, the better. Han the Man writes, what's the best way to clean a pastry brush? I want to remove all the egg or oil without ruining, what is this word?
Let's go bristles.
Bristles, okay. This is a perpetual problem for pastry chefs. I have a real grievance with the way most pastry brushes are designed. They always lose bristles, they're hard to clean, the handles are wooden, so you can't put them in the dishwasher. This is a lot. I think the best way to do it is to basically get like a glass or quart container of really, really hot soapy water and then put the brush in and agitate the bristles really, really well to help dislodge any like crusted on egg or anything like that. If you don't thoroughly get the egg out, it tends to like harden and get crusty and brittle, and that's really frustrating. So just really hot water, a little bit of soap, lots of rinsing, and then letting it dry fully. That's your best bet. I tried making your blueberry danishes a while ago. The pastry flaked, but barely, and not all the way through. I noticed some butter peeking through when I was assembling. Is this why? It was really dense when it baked. I was confused because I didn't overbake them. I'd like to know your opinion. If you noticed that the butter was kind of like oozing out of the pastry as you were rolling them, that means it wasn't cold. It had kind of softened and reached room temperature. And what happens if it doesn't go into the oven cold is it immediately melts before you get any like puffing action from the yeast in the dough. So you don't get the separation, you don't get that like formation of the layers, and you are gonna get a dense pastry. So that just means that you didn't chill the dough long enough. Even if you do find that the dough is chilled, but you still get butter leaking out, that is also a sign that it just wasn't rested long enough. So make sure your fridge is actually cold, because you can even put it in for the amount of time it says, but it won't get cold if your fridge has warmed up a little bit. So more time in the fridge, chill them before you bake them, and you shouldn't have the same problem. Chocolate chip cookies and brownies. I've been making them with the same recipe for years, but I've never had a batch turn out the same as the last. Too crisp, too soft, too sweet, etc. Why is that? Texturally, I understand. I can't tell you why one batch might be sweeter than the last if you're following the same recipe. I would say try weighing your ingredients and like making notes in the margins of like how much, if you're measuring in volume, try weighing. That is definitely the best way to get a consistent result. It might be happening in the oven. So it could be partly the result of your bakeware and your oven itself. I'm curious to know if you're getting different results because you're baking them in different places. That's very common. A crisp cookie could be a soft cookie that you just baked longer. That's probably the likeliest answer. So get an oven thermometer. It might be that your oven is like fluctuating wildly, and maybe one batch goes in, your oven temp drops, those come out really soft. You put the next one in, the oven spikes, you get like a really crispy batch that's maybe a little burned on the bottom. So I would say use a scale, check your oven, maybe have it recalibrated, get a thermometer, and also make sure you're using the same bakeware, like a light colored aluminum pan. You should be good. Hey Claire, I tried to make a croquembouche. It failed horribly. Firstly, my cream puffs did something quite strange. They looked great in the oven, puffy and round, but when I pulled them out and turned them over, the undersides had sunken in toward the center/top of the puff. So from a side profile, they looked a little bit like boomerangs. Okay, so this issue of a kind of like concave bottom, I wonder if you greased the pan that you piped your pâte à choux onto. Greasing the pan means that you don't get any sort of like adhesion between the dough and the pan itself, so you do get like a hollowed out bottom. It might also be that you baked them a little bit hot and there was such like an extreme sort of contraction of the dough as it puffed because it was losing moisture so fast that happened. So you can try putting them in hot but then reducing the oven temp. So you get like an initial blast to heat to initiate the puffing, but then they're not going the whole time. They have a little bit more of like a slow opportunity to dry out. Ditto if you baked on a piece of silpat or like a silicone baking mat, those can retain grease really well, so try parchment next time. I think you'll be good. My baking issue is with one of my favorite recipes from Dessert Person, the almond poppy bundt. I've made this recipe 10 times, but the issue I have the majority of the time is when the bottom of the bundt has that dense layer like yours did in the video. Oh, it's too hot. That slice doesn't look that good because I cut it hot. It is really too hot. See how like it looks dense right there? It's just because I cut it hot. In the video you said it was because you didn't wait long enough to unmold the cake. I always wait the amount of time that was listed in the original recipe to unmold the bundt, but still get that dense layer. Clearly this issue hasn't stopped me from making the cake because it's delicious either way. However, when I bring the cake to people, I feel a little embarrassed that there's a section of the cake that looks dense. Can you help? Never apologize for the way your bake looks to anyone. Sometimes when you're making a cake, if you do get a dense layer at the very bottom, it can actually be from under mixing because you're not building the structure that's required for the cake to kind of support itself. So it might be interesting to try if actually mixing more and really kind of working that batter, because that is a batter that is really high in fat. So you don't actually develop a lot of gluten because the fat kind of coats the flour and you don't get a lot of development. So I would actually try mixing more. That could be that's probably the most likely issue actually. So I'd be really interested to hear if that fixes it. You also might find that you have a really deep bundt pan, whether one that's sort of like a little bit more sloped and a little bit wider. So it could also be the pan. If you feel like if the cake is really, really tall, what happens is it can't really support itself and it will compress a little bit because it just has this like, you know, quite a bit of weight resting on a smaller base. So try using a bundt pan, especially if you feel like yours is a little bit on the tall side. Claire, I've been baking since elementary school. I'm 24 and I've never felt confident enough to make a layer cake. Are there tips? My fundamental skills are solid and I'm willing to buy nice ingredients. I just want it to be pretty. Okay, there's lots we can do here. Layer cakes are a lot about having the right equipment, having 3 identical light colored cake pans with 2-inch sides. Sometimes if the sides are too low, that's what really encourages doming. And doming is what can get in the way of a layer cake. Having an offset spatula to help you like applying the frosting. I would say this isn't necessary, but a cake turntable can also be really, really useful. But if you have solid fundamental baking skills and you know how to, know that your cake is fully baked in the middle, how to not over bake it, how to fill the pans, like invest in a kitchen scale so you know you're pouring the same amount of batter into each of the pans. That's great. You don't have to tort the layers or separate them. You can just leave them as is from the pan. I would just recommend removing the domes. So if you do have that kind of curved top, using a serrated knife, horizontally slicing off that dome so that you can stack them really evenly. I don't think it's necessary to go to the extreme of like using a level or, I don't know, like applying frosting with a piping bag or anything like that. But I would say for your first layer cake, don't try to attempt like an ultra smooth frosting look. That can be a little bit more advanced, especially if you don't have a turntable, but you'll be fine. I am super intimidated by any recipes involving gelatin and any recipes involving yeast. What are some good places to start with both of these ingredients? Recipes of yours or others. I have both of your books though, so I'm ready on that front. For a while, I was scared of puff pastry or any kind of flaky pastry, and your recipe for palmiers helped me get over that. With gelatin, I would say start with like a panna cotta. That's a really great kind of like super easy, low lift recipe to start kind of working with gelatin. The thing that I think is intimidating about yeast is it feels like there's a lot of options. There's instant yeast, there's fast acting yeast, there's active dry yeast. I almost always call for active dry yeast because it's just so common and easy to find. If you have active dry yeast, keep it in the fridge. It should stay cold because it is rather temperature sensitive. I find that people get really tripped off by that step of proofing where you want to like see little bubbly patches to make sure the yeast is alive. I mean, maybe once or twice in my entire career I've had yeast that wasn't alive. It almost always is alive, so it's just something you can kind of, as long as you dissolve it in a little bit of liquid, maybe that liquid's a little bit warm to kind of get things activated and incorporate into the recipe, that's really all you have to do. Proper storage, if you're using active dry, dissolve it in a little bit of a warm liquid and proceed, and I know you'll be fine. With yeast, maybe try focaccia because you don't have to do any sort of complicated shaping. It's made in a pan. It's pretty good for beginners. All right, I know it's frustrating to have something not turn out at home. It's like a waste of ingredients. And I know I say this have said this before, and it's a cliche, but it's true. When things don't turn out, it's an opportunity to learn more. You do tend to learn more from your failures than from your successes. So try to reframe it a little bit and like keep a positive attitude and try again, because then it's super empowering when that thing does turn out a second time. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm skipping this question. I don't like this question. I think this person's not following the directions. I explained it in the video.
And probably the book.
Customer's always right.
Incorrect.